I'm Indy Nidell, and this is Out of the Trenches, where I sit here in the chair of wisdom and answer your questions about the First World War. Horvard Graudo from Patreon writes, how did they manage to keep the soldiers from not deserting en masse, but in the millions go over the top just to be slaughtered? I cannot see the motivation they used: honor, freedom, king and Kaiser, fatherland, God, justice. Thanks for an excellent show that just gets better and better. Well, you're welcome. I'm glad you like it. You pretty much answered your own question. There really wasn't only one motivation why soldiers were willing to fight for their country. There were many. To understand the Great War better, you have to think back 100 years and imagine being one of those men living in their times. Throughout the 19th and early 20th century, you had a culture in some ways hugely different from ours today. The country, the fatherland, the motherland was a more tangible concept, particularly in the early 20th century, than it is today. It was home. It was your family, your pride, your future, your past. The nation was portrayed as your family. The men and women who shared a common culture and a common heritage had to stick together almost in a form of selfless altruism, okay? And war was a widely accepted way of defending those principles in times of turmoil like the Great War. Fighting and dying for those principles was widely understood, sometimes for freedom, sometimes for family, and sometimes it was king or Kaiser. Soldiers, of course, did not want to die, but to accept death as a possibility when victory and the security of everything that was dear to you back home was on the line, that was a different thing. But that mindset was different when victory was out of reach, or the generals or officers plainly ordered suicidal charges. You can see that well in the later stages of the war. You had mutinies in France where soldiers had the feeling they were needlessly throwing their lives away. You had open revolt and revolution in Russia where soldiers felt like they were herded like cattle to the slaughter. You had revolution in Germany as sailors did not want to sacrifice their lives in a suicidal sea battle just to make a last stand. As long as victory was possible, and as long as soldiers had the feeling that their service was for the greater good, they were willing, or let's say they agreed, to do their part. I think it is fair to say that nearly all of them hated war. They hated fighting and killing just like we do in general today. But they were born in a different time, a time when the horrors and sacrifices of war were more accepted as a means to an end, a time of duty, I guess you'd say. Joe Scaife from Patreon writes, hi Indian team, thanks for this excellent show. Nice to hear. How were executions for crimes such as desertion organized? I can't imagine any soldier would want to be part of a firing squad executing fellow soldiers, especially since the sentencing often seems so harsh. Was being made part of a firing squad seen as a punishment, or was it a job soldiers signed up for willingly? You could pretty safely say that most of the soldiers that had to be part of a firing squad did not want to be part of a firing squad, did not want to shoot their fellow comrades. For generals or officers, it was easier to make an example and to punish cowardice in the face of the enemy. But what of the soldiers that had to carry out those orders? Shooting someone for running away from the horrors they would sometimes rather run away from themselves. Shell-shocked soldiers, half crazy with fear, young boys, not even, say, 16 years old, that should not have been soldiers in the first place, and you have to shoot them. Officers rightly feared that the squads would not fire. They often chose soldiers from their base camps, sometimes wounded men that were unfit for the front, but were still able to fire a rifle. In extreme cases, they would give out rum to make them drunk, or tell them that not all rifles were loaded with real bullets, so it was impossible to know which one killed the condemned man. Victor Sylvester, who would later become a world-famous musician and dancer, is one of the few who wrote down his firing squad experience. Mortified by the sight of the poor wretch tugging at his bonds, 12 of us, on the order, raised our rifles unsteadily. Some of the men, unable to face their ordeal, had got themselves drunk overnight. They could not have aimed straight if they tried, and contrary to popular belief, All 12 rifles were loaded. The condemned man had also been plied with whiskey during the night, but he had remained sober through fear. The tears were rolling down my cheeks as he went on, attempting to free himself from the ropes attaching him to the chair. I aimed blindly, and when the gun smoke had cleared away, we were further horrified to see that, although wounded, the intended victim was still alive. An officer in charge stepped forward to put the finishing touch with a revolver held to the poor man's temple. By the time I had taken part in 4 more executions, like the other executioners, I was screaming in my sleep and physically ill every day. That is a quote from The Monocled Mutineer. Check it out. Ohad Offman writes, "Hello Indy and the Great War crew. I'm a fan of your show and I find it very interesting and enlightening. I would very much appreciate it if you would answer my question for the Out of the Trenches segment." I'm going to. What was the Jewish involvement during the war? Since the Jews were spread all over Europe, was there conflict between different Jewish communities based on their country? Could you shed some light on the Jewish struggle against the Ottoman Empire during the war in modern-day Israel? Thanks. Keep on the good work. Okay. We don't have the exact number how many Jewish people fought in the war, but estimates go as high as 1.5 million fighting for their respective nations. Now, around 400,000 to 500,000 of those served in the Russian army, although they were not exceptionally popular there at high command. The Russian government feared that the Jews of Eastern Europe would ally with the Germans, since they often had cultural ties, and Yiddish was similar to the German language too. Many were deported from Western regions to be resettled further east. Anti-Semitism became stronger during the war, as there were many Jews that were well-known figures in the Bolshevik movement. Now, of course, anti-Semitism in Europe didn't start with Hitler and was well established before this war, especially in cultural hotspots like Vienna. As the war started, the old question of Jewish loyalty rose up again, and politicians and intellectuals openly argued about whether or not they could trust the Jewish community in their nations to fight for their nation. Now, in 1916, the German High Command wanted to investigate the popular rumor that only a small number of Jews served in the German army, and most of those only in the rear. With pressure from anti-Semitic politicians, they implemented the Judenzählung, the Jewish census, which would ideally prove their claims, but the results were never published. Today, we know that they discovered an overproportionate amount of German Jews in the German army, and many of them at the front lines. Many Jews wanted exactly that, to disprove false rumors of disloyalty, and that they were proud to serve in the German army and for the German nation. On a side note, many Jews who had that sense of pride for Germany during the Great War were unable to believe the warnings during the rise of Adolf Hitler to power. Many faced the threats from Hitler and the Nazis with the belief that their service in the Great War should have proven their loyalty, and that kept many ex-soldiers from leaving Germany before it was too late. But back to the First World War. In the Ottoman Empire, you had the Jewish and Zionist settlements in southern Syria and northern Palestine, the Yishuv, which were often financially supported by American Jews. As the war broke out, many foreigners, many that had only recently immigrated actually, were deported or pressed into service in the Ottoman army. The Jewish communities established an espionage network, the Nili, that passed on information to the British and secretly cooperated with Sir Mark Sykes, who established the Zion Mule Corps and the Jewish Legion. Eventually, they were exposed by the Ottomans, and most of the Nili members were executed, which might have led to a similar fate for the Jewish people as for the Armenians if the German command under Erich von Falkenhayn had not intervened. Big topic. We will do at least one whole special on this soon. If you'd like to see how the Arab Revolt against the Ottoman Empire began, you can click here for our episode about that. Please like us on Facebook, and maybe you can write to me personally and I'll write to you and we'll become best friends. See you next time.